The Romans left a long-lasting legacy on the world. The legacy of the Romans' military tactics were not 100% homegrown. Their tactics were learned from selective borrowing. Selective borrowing is a tactic of picking and choosing the things they want from an empire or civilization and using them in your own empire or civilization, often changing them to your liking. The tortoise was a defensive formation by which the legionaries would hold their shields above their heads, except for the front rows, holding them forwards, creating a shell-like armor, shooting them against arrows and other projectiles from the front or above. The order to repel cavalry brought about the following information. The first rank would form a firm wall with their shields, only their pila, or long spears, protruding, forming a vicious line of glistening spearheads ahead of the wall of shields. The Greeks used a similar tactic called a phalanx that combined both of these tactics and would consist of rows of spear-armed hoplites, Greek soldiers, all protecting each other and presenting a wall of shields and spears pointed at their enemies. The first two rows of a phalanx were able to stab at opponents with their spears that protruded from between their shields. The first three rows, or ranks, of a phalanx could stab their opponent, while the back ranks would brace the front rows to prevent the front rows from retreating and support the all-important unity of the formation. The manuals indicate that a cavalry force fought in a formation looking much like this. An example based on a force of 20 small war bands, or 4,600 cavalrymen. The main force would be the fighting lane, approximately 1,500 men, and the supporting lane, approximately 1,300 men, with gaps in it to allow the fighting lane to withdraw through if necessary. The wings, which were 2 rows by 400 men, also called the liers in wait, tried to get behind or into the flank of the enemy force in a sweeping movement around the forces. Far out of sight, the flanks would try to get behind or into the flank of the enemy force in a sweeping move around the forces, far out of sight. The flanks would be 2 rows by 200 men. Either side of the main fighting lane weren't meant to prevent the enemy's wings or flanks from circling one's own force. Often the right flank was used to attack the side of the opponent's main body or battle structure. Striking from the right, it drove into the left of the opponents, which was hard to defend as most warriors would bear their weapon with their right arm. At the back of the force, a third lane, called the reserve, approximately 500 men, would be posted on the sides, ready either to help defend flanks, steady any forces in the fighting lane, driven back by enemy forces through the supporting lane, or intervene any flanking assaults on the enemy. This leaves the general's own escort, which would most likely lie to rear of the force and would consist of about 100 men. The wedge was commonly used by attacking legionnaires. Legionnaires formed up in a triangle, the front tip being one man pointing towards the enemy. The saw was the opposite tactic to the wedge. In the case of 2 Roman armies fighting each other in a civil war, one might say that the saw inevitably was the response to a wedge by the other forces. Skirmishing formation was a widely spaced up line of troops as opposed to the tighter packed battle It allowed for greater mobility and would have found many uses in the tactical handbooks of Roman generals. The orb is a defensive position in the shape of a circle taken by a unit in desperate straits. It allows for a reasonably effective defense, even if parts of the